Okay. So Lynn Novick, you are one of the directors and producers of the Vietnam War, along with Ken Burns. It's the 18-hour epic documentary about probably the most divisive war in U.S. history. Obviously, this is a subject that's rife with story opportunities for documentarians, but I'm curious, I mean, you guys have done a lot of interesting documentaries. What about this story spoke to you at this current moment, as opposed to, say, years earlier or years later?
You know, I've really been obsessed with the Vietnam War my entire life. I was born in 1962, so my entire childhood, the Vietnam War was essentially the major story of my life, and the reactions to it, the protests against it, and the crisis our country went through. So as an adult, I've always wanted to do something about the Vietnam War, and Ken and I have talked about it for years. And we finally decided that the time was right, not last week, but in 2007, because these things take so long. We made the decision to make the film in 2007, knowing it would come out in 2016 or 2017. We couldn't have imagined what our world would look like, but nonetheless, we had a very strong sense that even then, and certainly now, our country is extraordinarily polarized, and we're living in sort of fractious and frightening times, and we don't listen to each other, and we have these sort of subterranean chasms, schisms in our society, and a lot of that can be traced back to the Vietnam War. So we felt it was this sort of national trauma, in a way, like an unfinished business that we have gone through and never really understood. And we knew it would take a while, but that's why we wanted to make the film.
So 10 years worth of effort, and now we have it now. Perfect timing as well. So with a subject this vast and sprawling, where do you even begin? I mean, how do you even get started on something like this?
Beginning a project like this is pretty terrifying for all of us. It really is. It's a blank piece of paper. There's no roadmap. It's a concept. And what we began with was a couple of main points. One, we're going to tell the story through the eyes of people who lived through it, because unlike the Civil War film or other films that we've done that take place in the distant past, the people who went through this experience are around, and we can ask them what it was like. So we decided early on we were not going to have historians appear on camera. We were not going to have experts. We were going to have living witnesses. And we were going to have mostly sort of ordinary people that our audience wouldn't know much about. So you would go through a process of discovery of what the war meant through them. And the most important thing that's sort of a corollary to that is that we didn't want to tell just an American story. So often when Americans think about the Vietnam War, we think it's an American experience. And certainly it has been, but it's also undeniably a Vietnamese story. And there are many different Vietnamese perspectives, and we didn't know what to expect, but we didn't feel we didn't want to even bother trying to do this film without incorporating as many Vietnamese points of view as possible.
Well, that brings to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is, I mean, you interview about, I don't know, 80 to 100 people for this movie.
Right.
So talk about, I mean, tracking these people down, and what were the experiences of interviewing these people like? I mean, how do you prepare for something like that? What were some things that kind of came about from that?
Well, Sarah Botstein, our producer, and I took the lead on doing most of the interviews. I conducted about 85 of the interviews that are in the film, and each one's a little bit different, but primarily it's about building trust and spending time with people. We're talking about sometimes extraordinarily painful, difficult, wrenching memories, things that they're very conflicted about to this day, and they're hard to talk about. And to get someone to want to be even comfortable to even ask that question, you have to spend time with people. And we also had to choose people. So we probably talked to 1,000 people to choose the 100 that we interviewed. And then it's really a question of treating people with respect and with an open mind. And I found the most important thing is to be present and not to judge, and to really try as much as possible to keep an open mind, and to have the person tell you their story and feel that whatever they have to say, you will listen and let them tell the whole story, and then you can continue the conversation. That's not that easy to do, frankly. We're always kind of thinking about the next thing. And to just kind of let go of all that and just be fully present and treat people with respect, that goes a long way.
Well, I mean, you are looking at this from several different perspectives, as you said before. Obviously, there's the American perspective. There's also the Vietnamese perspective. And in the case of this war, there's the people who fought in it and the people who opposed it.
Right.
So there's a lot of different points of view. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. It was really important to us that the film represent people who probably couldn't be in the same room together, if I could have a conversation in the film. Sarah always talks about that you could have someone who was radically opposed to the war and someone who believes it was a just cause. And if you put them in a room together, they'd probably end up shouting at each other. And by hearing each of them and putting their testimony together, we let them have a conversation. And, you know, part of this is an exercise for ourselves in humility and kind of letting go of our own baggage. So talking to people that I might not agree with, or that I might think coming into it, you know, what they have to say doesn't make sense to me. And when you really listen to other people, at least you can understand where they're coming from. And it doesn't mean that there's no moral compass here, or that everyone's entitled to their opinion, no matter how crazy it is. I mean, we sort of held ourselves to a pretty scrupulous accounting on facts. So we didn't want people sort of telling us stories that didn't make sense and weren't true. And other than that, we really left room for people's feelings and opinions to have validity. And I think what's interesting over the course of the film is that you see a lot of people evolve from how they felt about the war when it started to when it ended to how they feel about it now, regardless of their experience. And I found one of the most profound and devastating experiences was talking to someone like Tim O'Brien, who became a writer after the war and started off believing that, you know, he's a patriotic American, you would serve your country. By the time he got drafted, he was against the war. And he agonized about whether or not to go to Canada because he felt the war was wrong. And to this day, he tortures himself with the feeling that he was a coward for going to Vietnam. And that kind of just turns everything you think upside down about what is a hero, who's a hero, and what does bravery really mean. I forget the question, but I think it's just sort of, it speaks to just people take you places you don't expect to go. And we hope our film does that.
Right. One of my favorite authors, by the way, Tim O'Brien, along with everyone else.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's amazing. And he's so, you know, I think in his work, he sort of conflates or, you know, plays around with what's true, what's real, what happened to him, because he has a character named Tim O'Brien in his book, Things They Carried. But a lot of what's in there is actually fictional. But he told us the true story of what his life was really like at that time. And it was a great gift to the project.
Well, I mean, that can be a good jumping off point to ask you this. I mean, so within these 10 episodes and 18 hours, obviously you're constructing, you're recounting real life events, but
Right.
there is, obviously in hindsight, there's a narrative of what leads up to these events. So can you
Right.
talk a bit about crafting these true life events into a narrative that is, you know, that people can understand and follow and be engaged by?
Yeah, that is such a great question, because that is really the crux of what we try to do. And it's not just me or Ken, it's really a collaboration with our writer, Jeff Ward, and our producer, Sarah Botson, and our editors and our advisors to figure out what should that narrative be? What are the important facts? What actually happened? And then, you know, having kind of that as the backdrop or the background, or kind of like a timeline of the true history of the Vietnam War, and then finding these little jewels in the crown, which are the kind of individual stories, and putting them in place where they belong, is a very delicate kind of three-dimensional chess game. And there's a little bit of trial and error, because we're not doing it on paper, we're actually doing it in a timeline of a film. So you have to be able to watch it and respond to it emotionally and intellectually and every other way. And it's intuitive in that we sort of collect the stories and then we see how they fit. And sometimes you just don't know, and some things you can't make up. I mean, there's one particular veteran in the film, John Musgrave, who I remember the first time I spoke with him, I thought he was an extraordinary storyteller and, you know, master of his own narrative. But we couldn't have imagined how profound his telling of his story would be that he's in almost every episode, because he evolves from a gung-ho Marine to a protester at the end, to someone who works with veterans. And it had to do with how he told his story as much as what happened to him. And once we have all that, then it's kind of like, how do we build a scene around an experience John has had that makes his story kind of the front, you know, the foreground of the experience for the viewer. And you multiply that by 100 times, and that's how we make the film.
Right.
Yeah.
You've also got a wealth of material to work with already. I mean, news footage of the war, news footage of protests, and things like that. So, I mean, how do you sort through and sift through all this stuff and then come to the conclusions of what to include in the film and what not to include?
It's terrible sometimes. Some of our favorite material, of course, ends up on the cutting room floor. We have a team of producers who really go through enormous amounts of material and present it to us and to our editors so that we can make those choices. And it usually ends up being partly a function of what is accurate to the description, to the moment that we're trying to evoke. So, there might be a great shot of a helicopter, but it's from 5 years later. Well, we're not going to use it here. So that sort of trying to be responsible and scrupulous about what we're showing in relation to what we're saying, that helps. And then it's really the sort of the ebb and flow of the narrative. So sometimes there are great scenes that have great archival material that just don't fit in the story that we're telling. And we really have to structure the entire series, all 18 hours. And then each episode has to have a kind of a story, or a beginning, middle, and end within the larger whole. And so what's really great is so much of the archival material that we collected, you're really seeing kind of the cream of the crop, basically. The greatest shots, the most powerful material. Sometimes I will say we had to extract some of the most revolting footage, really just the goriest, most horrendous sort of, body parts and eviscerations, and just the true carnage of war is a lot to take. And so we had to really carefully decide how much of that could we take and could our audience take, while still not sugarcoating or sort of romanticizing the war.
Right. Well, I mean, that brings up an interesting point as well, because I mean, I'm curious, how do you get to that determination of what to include? Because like you said, I mean, you don't want to take away from the honesty of the film and sugarcoat the war. So, I mean, how did you arrive at that conclusion?
Trial and error, really. I think our first pass of the film, the first rough cut, was probably 22 hours long of the entire series all laid out. And in that, we sort of say we throw in the kitchen sink, which is not exactly true, but we throw a lot in, and then we kind of weed out. And in some cases, it was just impossible to watch, because your visceral reaction was so strong to some of the really horrendous images that you couldn't actually follow what happened after that. So we tried to include as much as we possibly could. And also be honest to what the American public would have seen to some degree in some cases. So some of the really most disturbing material wasn't actually seen at the time. Sometimes it was. And so we had to kind of, manage that as well. But, the most infamous footage of the Vietnam War is the assassination of the Viet Cong agent during the Tet Offensive. That was also a very famous photograph of the moment of the man being shot by the South Vietnamese chief of police. And there's footage of that NBC does not like to license because it is so graphic and can be used gratuitously to sensationalize violence. And so our producer, Mike Welt, worked really closely with NBC to make sure that we were showing to the frame what was shown on TV at that time. So it's shocking and deeply disturbing. And we felt it was important that our audience see what the American public saw back then. So.
You've been a frequent collaborator of Ken Burns's for almost 30 years now, going all the way back to the Civil War, I think. Yeah. So what is that working relationship like?
It's evolved as we've worked together for such a long time. So at the beginning, I really was learning about how to make these historical documentaries on a large scale. With baseball was my first producing job. And over time evolved into really a collaboration of partners to kind of have a shared vision of what the film would look like. And then a lot of intellectual and creative arm wrestling to make the best film. And I think there's a lot of creative tension and also collaboration. And it really is true on the very micro level of, which line of this interview should we cut? Which picture should we see? What song should we be listening to what's this episode about? To what's the whole film going to be about? And so, and also working with our writer, Jeff Ward, and our editors and our producer, sort of communicating to them what we think the film should be about. We don't always agree. And so in that, complexity and disagreement is always a desire to make the film better. On many of the films I've worked on with Ken, I have done a lot of the interviewing, but not all. And then in the edit room, we kind of sit down together, roll up our sleeves, and really wrestle the film to the ground. And it's the most fun. We end up, what I think is great about our edit room is that there's no idea that we don't want to hear. And we're sort of soliciting feedback from everybody, interns, guests, friends, colleagues. And then we have to really decide, okay, that idea is worth trying and that idea isn't worth trying. And then I think what happens a lot is that it's pretty obvious when this is a good idea, and it's pretty obvious when it's a bad idea. So we try each other's ideas out, and I think I'm the first one to say, that was my idea, that sucked. You know, or, okay, that was your idea, that's great. And it's pretty clear once you see it, what works. Yeah, and I mean, I think in this film, you know, I was very strongly a proponent of getting Vietnamese voices into the film, which Ken absolutely supported and agreed with. But it was up to me to kind of basically prove that we could make it work. So Sarah and I spent a lot of time in Vietnam trying to make that happen.
Well, I mean, that leads to an interesting point, because I mean, the films that you make together are very much about American history and all of the you know, the warts and messiness, and also all of the glory. So I mean, I think arriving at, you know, this is it difficult to arrive at a point of view, I guess, for what this movie is going to be about?
Well, we really try to keep that pretty open, and to not impose too much of what it should be about, and really let the material help us figure that out. And that's not easy to do, because we all have our preconceptions. So to really keep an open mind and say, you know, I don't know. I know we want to hear from Vietnamese. I know I want to hear about what was really going on with the, you know, behind the scenes in the halls of power, but how those things interact. We got asked a lot, especially in academic circles, what's your argument going to be? What's your, you know, thesis you're going to try to prove with this film? And we really didn't have one. And it's hard to explain. It's hard to really prove that, but we honestly didn't set out to prove a point, except to find out what happened. But knowing that it was a terrible tragedy, and that millions of Vietnamese people died and 58,000 Americans died, and we wanted to know why and how we all felt about it. And I think to assign responsibility, because one of the things that is among many aspects of the story that are so devastating is the lack of accountability on our side, our leaders, for decisions that they made that got us into this and kept us there long after it was clear we weren't going to win. And to sort of, you know, show the world how this happened and who's responsible. That's about it.
Right. Throughout the years, you two have been rewarded with Emmy nominations and wins. You won an Emmy for your work on the film Baseball, very different kind of movie from
this. True.
You're also a Peabody winner for Frank Lloyd Wright, that documentary, another vastly different kind of film. What has that recognition meant for you in your career?
You know, both of those two, the Emmy Award and the Peabody, came pretty early in my career. So I think it was incredibly validating and affirming to have the recognition of our peers. That is what really means more than almost anything. The people who do this work and know how hard it is and how challenging it is to make these films, to be recognized by them is enormously meaningful. And yet I also recognize, especially now, there are so many great programs. There's so much content, nonfiction content out there. It's very competitive. And I think it's an honor to be nominated, honestly. I really feel sort of humbled by the fact that there's so much great work being done in so many different ways, and different sort of people reinventing the documentary genre, or it's not even a genre. It's really, I don't even know what I would call it. There's so many different ways to tell a story that's a true story. And I really admire a lot of the other filmmakers that are out there. So to be in their company is really an honor. And I really mean that.
Well, the films you two make continue to be a gold standard for how to make these kinds of films. And Lynn Novick, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And congratulations on this epic achievement.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
You're welcome. Same here.
Okay.